The United States is pleased with the adoption today of Resolution 2023, imposing additional sanctions on Eritrea for its failure to comply with its obligations under previous Security Council resolutions, including 1907, passed 2 years ago.
Regarding Eritrea, it should be noted that for the third consecutive year, the monitoring group has found no evidence of Eritrean support to the Somali terrorist group Al-Shabaab. The sanction regime has proven fruitful, but it must be terminated when the reasons for its establishment are no longer existent.
We were forced to abstain on voting of Resolution 2317 for the following reasons. Support by Eritrea to the terrorist group Al-Shabaab, as well as the border dispute between Djibouti and Eritrea, were the founding criteria for imposing restrictive measures on Asmara in 2009. Since then, the situation on the ground has significantly changed. The monitoring group, in its outcome reports for 3 years in a row, has concluded that there is not evidence of Eritrea providing assistance to Al-Shabaab, and the border dispute with Djibouti is being settled through mediation with Qatar. Allow me to confirm here that our abstention is fully in line with our unchanging position on the matter of sanctions. Sanctions have to be dealt with not as a means in and of themselves, or rather an ends in and of themselves, but rather a temporary and obligatory procedure which we draw upon with clear limits to attain a political goal. It is unacceptable for sanctions to go on endlessly without any time-bound criteria. It's also important that we deal with sanctions in a sufficiently flexible manner such that they can be reviewed according to new data on the ground.
The sanctions in the relevant Security Council resolutions are not conducive to achieving the above-mentioned objectives. China hopes that the Security Council will take into account the changes on the ground and constantly revisit the relevant content of the resolutions and make timely adjustments.
We decided to abstain in this vote until there is something new to give us reason to believe that we can extricate ourselves from this situation. We could not support this. We regret this situation, and we don't see how these issues can be resolved within the framework of the mandate of the Sanctions Committee. We have always said that the Sanctions Committees have to have an immediate political aim, and they cannot be used as a permanent way of delivering collective punishment. So it doesn't seem to matter much in the decision on this resolution or in this committee what Eritrea does and its positive steps forward or the report of the monitoring group. It doesn't seem to matter. All of this, these meetings and initiatives and so on and so forth, apparently the decision comes down to one member or a few permanent members, and this is something we have to review.
United Nations sanctions against Eritrea for alleged support for Al-Shabaab in Somalia. In the last 5 years, nobody can find any evidence that Eritrea has given any support to Al-Shabaab. Now, in the United Nations, they have an annual discussion of sanctions against different countries. And the discussion in October 2014, a year ago, 14 out of the 15 members of the Security Council said we are in favor of lifting sanctions against Eritrea. There was only one country that said we're opposed to lifting sanctions, and that was the United States. So that means that sanctions cannot be lifted because if the United States votes no, that constitutes a veto.
I think the problem is that, as you well know, the United States is dependent upon Ethiopia for its peacekeeping, as we call it, contributions in Somalia, and its peacekeeping contributions in South Sudan, and its support of our drone facilities, and that makes it very difficult for us to put any kind of influence on Ethiopia. I think it's unrealistic to expect us to change that, but my concern is that rhetorically, we have not defended the border. When Ethiopia, and it admitted that it attacked Eritrea in July, the statement from the State Department was both sides need to behave themselves. And when Eritrea was bombed by Ethiopian forces last March, there was dead silence. Time and time again, in fact, we've been silent when our allies have transgressed against other countries. And what I feel afraid of is that Eritrea very justifiably believes that if Ethiopia attacks it, they are alone. And it's that perception that's leading them to be so paranoid about their defenses. And that is something we can act on, and I hope that we will.
U.S. is unable really to be a neutral party in the Ethiopian-Eritrea dispute.
Kind of a follow-up on the resignation of the Somalia-Eritrea monitoring group sanctions, Dinesh Matani. At the stakeout on Friday, UK Ambassador Lyle Grant said that this constituted discipline of the monitor, but didn't seem to indicate, and I've spoken to others, that there's any kind of training done by Security Council Affairs to sort of say, like, what is appropriate behavior and what is not. Is that not an accurate statement? Was Mr. Matani, disciplined, as was said on camera? And what's the process for replacing him?
The process for replacing him will be the normal process. In terms of discipline, I really have nothing to add to what I've already said. Clearly, he did something that was not appropriate. He was shown the letter that he sent out on UN letterhead. I think it's probably basic protocol for anybody who works for any organization not to use the company or the organization's letterhead for purposes other than official business. I mean, I think it's anything that any one of us would know.
What's your view of the do you see any evidence, for example, of Eritrea supporting al-Shabaab at this time?
It did not come up, and I have seen no evidence of Eritrea supporting al-Shabaab, no.
I have recommended that the U.S. government lift sanctions on Eritrea. I've recommended that the U.S. government stop personalizing politics in Eritrea. And I've recommended that, first and foremost, really, that the U.S. government stop tolerating Ethiopian irredentism, Ethiopian claims on Eritrean territory, which are frankly destabilizing to the entire region.
The Somalia-Eritrea Monitoring Group has concluded that, I quote, it has found no evidence of Eritrea's support to al-Shabaab in Somalia. With regards to the disputes between Eritrea and Djibouti, the presidents of the two countries have entrusted the state of Qatar to mediate their disputes. Since the two justifications for the imposition of the unjust sanction against Eritrea are non-existent, the correct, logical, and legal action should have been for the UN Security Council to immediately and unconditionally lift the unjust sanction against Eritrea and terminate the mandate of the Somalia-Eritrea Monitoring Group concerning the part of Eritrea. Any other pretext is unacceptable. It is a political agenda.
In Eritrea, we can't afford to get it wrong, as we did in Somalia, because Eritrea is more strategically positioned on the Horn of Africa than Somalia is. It's right across from Yemen. It's on a critically important trade route that accepts trillions of dollars a year in the passage of goods between China and the EU. If we get it wrong there, the impact on U.S. relations will be terrible.
I'm very jealous of Eritrea because Eritrea has been able to break free from the bondage that has been our chain in Africa for a very long time. We know Eritrea is one of the countries that have struggled to come out of the domination of the world. It is human that you fight for freedom. You struggle to be independent. We have also seen that it's also on the other side, many that try to dominate others. But that is no longer of a 21st century standard and therefore no longer acceptable. But yet we know that even in the midst of African countries, there are still many that are yet to free themselves from the partitioning of Africa, the amalgamation of nations, independent nations, to form one, not because the people themselves wanted it, but because some other person, some other group, some other interest wanted it to be so. I'm a Nigerian, and I know, and many people will know, that Nigeria continues to struggle under the bondage of a creation that had nothing at all to do with them. It is not a creation for them, and therefore it will never serve their interests. So in other words, I'm very jealous of Eritrea.
In this report, you make the case that the U.S. policy of isolating Eritrea has failed, and that the U.S. should instead engage with Eritrea. So why engagement, and why now?
Sure. Well, in the first place, I think it's important to point out that the U.S. doesn't have the power to isolate a country anymore. It's a multipolar world, and when we talk about isolating a country, what we're really talking about is forcing that country to pivot towards either the U.S. or towards other powers, be that China, be that the Middle East. And in this case, what we've seen is that Eritrea has successfully done that.